we know, and we've been told many different times, that God uses the physical world around us to teach us lessons, spiritual lessons that we can apply as we try to grow and as we try to become more like Christ. Christ used many physical examples that tangible things people could see and understand to explain deeper subjects as well. And we have, ever since I can remember, talked about how the holy days revolve around the harvest calendar in Israel, and we've generally tied things in using that example. But it seems like in my experience at least, we have kind of just focused on there's a harvest in the fall, there's a harvest in the spring, and that's as far as we've gone into that, the calendar, that physical part of what God created and what was going on in Israel. And, over the years, we've dealt with, in that way, we've talked about growing and harvesting and planting. What we're going to do today is look at something that I came across that gives a little bit more depth, that actually takes the harvest calendar and in some ways shows us that can apply to us through the course of the year, and that there are different stages and different phases of our Christian life that in some ways mimic the harvest schedule that was going on in Israel. And hopefully it expands our knowledge. It gives us reminders of things that we should be doing and how we live our life moving through this whole year, going from the feast period that I think it's about 7 weeks that we came back from the feast, moving into this period between now and the spring holy days, that there are lessons from the growth cycle that we can even take and apply during this time. So as we get into that, I'd like you to turn to Acts chapter 2. I'm going to read a part of the message that Peter gave, that first Pentecost message that Peter gave. Acts chapter 2, and we're going to begin in verse 29. And I'm going to read a decent number of scriptures here, and then we'll talk about the point that we're getting to with those. Verse 29, men and brethren, let me speak freely to you concerning the patriarch David, that he's both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to set on his throne, he, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in the grave, and his flesh did not see corruption. This Jesus Christ was raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore, being exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Holy Father the promise of his Spirit, he poured out this which you now see and hear. They just seen that manifestation of the Holy Spirit in that first Pentecost. David didn't ascend into the heavens, but he says to him, my Lord said to my Lord, or the Lord said to my Lord, really speaking of God the Father versus speaking to Christ as the Son, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, let all of the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Paul was telling these people, giving them insight in something they had never understood before. They had never heard the Messiah talked about this way. And in the context of what we're going to be talking about, there's parallels to this with some of the messages that we hear at the Feast of Tabernacles. Messages that are meant to reinforce and help us to see aspects of God's plan and what God is working for. And in the messages that we go after the feast, we come back and we hear messages. And these people were stricken into their heart with what they had just heard. And that's really the point. I'm going to read another verse or two here. But that's the point I want us to think about is when we hear things that we haven't heard before, are we stricken to the heart? Does it make us sit back and say, I never thought of things that way. How should I change? How should this change the way I live my Christian life? What we're going to talk about today isn't some grand, whole, huge thing, but it's an aspect of how we should live our Christian life that hopefully, as we go through this, there is a little bit of that stricken to the heart. I hadn't thought about what I should be doing right now in this way, and will I make that change? Will I do something differently? Verse 37, when they heard this, they were cut to the heart, and they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, "Men and brethren, what should we do?" They said, we've heard this. How should this change us? How should we change how we're living our life, how we're worshiping? And that's actually the title of the message, is Men and Brethren, what should we do? And I'll say men and women and all brethren, what should we do? How should we live our lives? How should we change? How should we grow? Do you look back on the feast from this point right now, 7 weeks past? Have you forgotten about what you heard at the feast, the rejuvenation hopefully everyone had from the feast? And are you using that to spur yourself to move forward, or have you forgotten those messages and you're just moving along, going from Sabbath to Sabbath? The growth cycle, as we look into this in more detail, builds on every step along the way. You wouldn't have a harvest if you didn't have planting and sowing and preparing and all of those things. I'm going to go and give you a story, some background information to where really it's the source material for the major part of this message. In 1908, there was an archaeologist named McAllister, R.A.S. McAllister, that was digging around in the ruins of Gezer. Gezer is about 40 miles west of Jerusalem. And in that time, in the early 1900s, this was even before World War I, there were tons of Europeans wandering around the Middle East, digging into things and digging things up because they were exploring antiquity. And that was the adventure for many Europeans, was going to the Middle East and working on a dig and trying to find something that no one had ever seen before. And of course, their knowledge varied, their skill in digging varied, their willingness to follow sound principles, archaeological principles, all varied. And apparently, from the stories that I was able to read, McAllister was on the low end of the spectrum. He was not the most diligent in preserving the record the way that it should have been. Many of his contemporaries, after seeing what he had done to the sites that he had worked on, felt like he destroyed more information than he actually preserved. He was just out there trying to make a name, trying to find that one great thing that would preserve his name in history. And for all of the damage that he might have done, he did find something that did have enduring value. A small limestone tablet that right now is believed to be the earliest example of Hebrew writing, from about 1000 BC. What he found was the best guess that people can make right now is that it was an educational tool, something that they would, either young people used or the teacher would use to help them remember the various growing seasons, the growing calendar, harvest calendar, however you want to call it, throughout the course of the year. And it's now called the Gezer calendar, not like an old Gezer location. Not the old guy calendar, the town calendar. So written on this tablet were 8 lines. Each one of those lines started with the name of one or two of the Hebrew months, and then it had an activity, an agricultural activity that was associated with those 2 months. So again, it was to help the young people remember what was supposed to be going on through the course of the year. And that's where we can find some spiritual principles or similarities, or at least guidelines, I guess I'll say, in how that spiritual year, how that physical year was worked in Israel. So I'll read the lines. You probably won't get all the months written down because I'm not going to stop and spell all of them. If you really want that kind of information, just see me afterwards and we can fill in some of the blanks. you also know, I believe, most of you know at least, there was a sacred calendar that starts in the spring, and there was an administrative calendar, I guess you could call it that, or another calendar that the country used that started in the fall. So we're starting, the start of this calendar starts with the 7th month as far as the sacred calendar goes. So it starts in Tishri, which is when the fall holy days occur. So the first line was Tishri and Heshvan. I guess I'll murder it one way or another. So it's 2 months, and it says 2 months of fruit harvest. Those 2 months were when the fruit harvest occurred. And actually, primarily, they say it was olives. It was the major fruit that was being harvested at that time. Then Kislev and Tevet, 2 months for grain sowing. This was preparing the ground, planting, cultivating and preparing the ground. And then Shivat and Adar, 2 months for gathering the winter crop. And now, so we're 6 months into the year after these first 3 lines. So we all know, basically 6 months after the fall holy days, we're into the spring holy days. So then the next line is Nisan, which is 1 month to process the late harvest. And that grain, that harvest that they're talking about right there was mostly flax, again, from what I can read. It's also the first month of that sacred calendar. It's the first month when the Passover and the days of unleavened bread are there. The next line, Ayar, 1 month for the barley harvest. Or another translation of that line said 1 month to bring the harvest to the city gates. Sivan, 1 month of the wheat harvest. Tammuz and Av, A-V, 2 months of pruning vines and harvesting grapes. And Elul, 1 month for the summer fruit. And again, apparently that was mostly a fig harvest. And then it cycles back. So it lays out how the harvest was produced, when the harvest occurred, when there was time for preparation, and when there was time for harvesting. And I've obviously had a little longer to think about this cycle. And as I go through these things, I continue to see that there are, at every one of these stages, there's application spiritually for some of these. We're only going to focus on the first couple months because that's where we are right now. But if you find this intriguing, there's a lot more written about how there are spiritual parallels through the course of this whole calendar. And again, to me, I was kind of interested when I read it because it provided a depth that I hadn't had before. And hopefully, as we share some of this, you'll feel that same way. And it will also be a spur for all of us as we move forward in this spiritual year, in this calendar year. So there are a few lessons that we're going to look at through how those months applied. We're setting kind of in the cusp between the first two. The first 2 months after the feast were a harvest time yet. And then after that harvest time was finished, it went into preparing for the next year, getting the ground ready, getting things, getting your seeds ready to plant, figuring out what you were going to plant, all of those different things. And the first lesson gets back to the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles is designed as a time where we enjoy the fruits of the harvest. Spiritually, it's supposed to be a time where we get to harvest, we get to reap, we get to enjoy what we've built spiritually. And we have messages that are prepared, men that have prepared part of that feast. And so it's important as we draw the parallels together that we remember that the feast is a time of a bounty, right? It's supposed to be a time of bounty. In Israel, there was an incredible push just before the feast to finish the things that needed to be harvested. It was important that they harvested because they would then use those for the Feast of Tabernacles. And what I'm getting at as we go through this is I want us to look back to the Feast of Tabernacles to some degree as we think about this message. and make sure that we took all of the harvest that God had prepared for us from that feast. I want us to think about that. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 23. We'll read verses 15 and 16 of Exodus 23. Again, these are familiar. You will keep the feast of unleavened bread, and you will eat unleavened bread 7 days as I've commanded you, at the time appointed in the feast in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt, and none of you shall appear before him empty, or me empty. And at the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labor, which you've sown in the field, and during the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you've gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. God's holy days, he recognizes 3 seasons there, I guess we'll say. But every one of those holy days is supposed to be a time where there's a harvesting. In other words, we're reaping from what we have sown in between all of those holy days. We're between the Feast of Tabernacles and the Spring Holy Days right now. We have a harvest that actually we can still go back and reap the harvest of the Feast of Tabernacles, most of us if we wanted to, because almost all the messages are available online. If you recognize that you might have missed some things from the Feast of Tabernacles, even within the growth calendar, this is still the 2 months of harvest. Maybe this is a good time for you to go back to your feast, to your notes, to the recorded messages, and make sure that you harvested everything that was God presented to you at that feast. Because that harvest is just like in Israel, that harvest gets you through the months where nothing is grown, nothing is planted. Spiritually, the Feast of Tabernacles is intended for us to be a harvest where that then helps us get through all of the dark times that we're going to be facing with Christmas and all of the other things until the Spring Holy Days. So it's important as we look at these parallels that we recognize that we should have been harvesting, and we still have an opportunity to harvest if we didn't really do it the way that we should have. Because, oh, that's great. Just a little tear in my Bible. This is when we're moving, and we need to be now preparing also for the next harvest. I hear, and I think probably all of us maybe have even said or felt from time to time, especially if you've been going to the feast for a long time, someone say, the feast just wasn't good this year. Or, really, there weren't any messages that I really liked or really struck me. Rarely, I would say never, do I hear someone go on and say, oh, that's probably because of me. It was probably my fault because I really didn't prepare to enjoy that bounty that God was providing. Most of the time when someone says that, they followed up with, the men that prepared the messages just didn't do their job, or I had something distracting me. Maybe that's as far as they go. And it's important to recognize that if we didn't enjoy the full harvest of the feast, blaming someone else isn't the right response. Now, there could be external forces that made it difficult for us. Every feast, many feasts, there are small things that happen. But God makes it possible for us to reap that harvest if we really have our heart set on it. I talked to someone, I think it might have been just last night, about there are some people who make excuses to not go to the feast, and there are some people who will do almost anything to get to the feast. And I think when you look at that, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, because there are reasons why sometimes you can't attend the feast. But where their heart, you can tell that there is a heart there, where they really know that they're going there for something very important. They look forward to that, and they'll sacrifice for that. Proverbs 6 has a good point to make. And this is a familiar scripture probably for most people. But many times, I would say most of the time where it's been used, where I've heard it used, it's talking about the physical aspect of life rather than a spiritual side of life. And yet this does have a spiritual component to it. Proverbs chapter 6, we'll begin reading in verse 6. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. Who, having, no captain, no overseer or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. Because of that attitude, because you're sleeping, because you're acting like a sluggard, your poverty will come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. If we are spiritually slumbering, we are not working the way that God wants us to work, tells us we need to work to continue to grow spiritually. We will find ourselves impoverished if we aren't being like the ant, pushing ourselves, trying to prepare when we need to prepare. The ant doesn't need someone looking over its shoulder to tell it now's the time where you should be out there working. Now's the time where you should be digging in. Now's the time when you should be studying and praying and fasting. Now is the time when you should be getting yourself ready for the spring holy days. The ant doesn't need that. We shouldn't, as Christians, need that either. We should recognize the need. It's programmed into the ant, right? God made ants to work that way. Made them, in some ways, for it to be an example for us. But if there's nothing that says our character can't be that programmed into us, that's the way we work, because it's who we are, not just because we know it's something we should do. The ant prepares when it's time to prepare. The ant harvests when it's time to harvest, and recognizes the difference between those two. And again, I'm still, to some degree, pointing back to the Feast of Tabernacles with this point. Did you have a poor man's Feast of Tabernacles? Or did you have a rich man's Feast of Tabernacles? Did you come back starving still? Or were you overflowing with whatever God prepared for you and you heard at the feast? Did you feel like you didn't have room to store it all? That it was that much of a blessing? And if you don't feel that way, again, where does the fault lie? And I'll remind you, there's still a chance. There's still a time to harvest that bounty that God provided. So that's one of the lessons that we're going to, I'm pointing out as far as this growth cycle and the spiritual similarities that we find within it. But as I mentioned, we're talking about these first 4 months really is the major focus of this message. After that harvest, it isn't a time to just cruise along. It's a time to start preparing for the next harvest. It's the time to look at ourselves, to look at what God provided and what needs to grow in our spiritual life over these next few months. It isn't a time to relax. There's work to be done now for each one of us. I've always noticed that, I shouldn't say always. I notice on occasion, let's be better about that there are always, in every congregation, there's a group of people who don't take notes, don't do anything to record anything that's heard. And I always, in relation to this message, how do you harvest if you can't remember? How do you have a spiritual harvest if you can't remember things? Now, thankfully, there are other ways now. When I was growing up, there wasn't recordings of every message, and you couldn't stream from anywhere in the nation or anywhere in the world almost sometimes, feast messages. But it is important that we have something within our spiritual preparation that allows us to refresh our memories about, to replenish that harvest. Because we forget. There's many times, I have a pretty long list, and I use my computer, so I actually do it on my laptop. Pretty long list of, oh wow, that's an interesting point, that's an interesting thought that the guy just made in that message. I'm going to need to study into that more. I want to look into that farther. And probably all of you have those kind of things where you think, oh, that's an interesting idea. It's a tangent to what the message is most of the time. It's not really the major focus. How do you remember those if you don't write things down? How do you take that little glimmer of something that God through his Spirit gave you and use that to add to the harvest that he's trying to help each one of us to produce? And that's just a question. How do you use that effectively? Because God speaks to us many times through the course of the week, and certainly sometimes when we're sitting in church. Now is the time to work. We're into that second stage of the growth cycle that I read from that Geezer calendar. Now is the time for preparing ourselves and getting things ready. God wants us to recognize that there's a harvest coming, but if we don't prepare the ground, if we don't get ourselves ready, then our individual harvest next spring will be something less. Something less than what it could be. There's also, in the Bible, when it talks about the growth seasons and how things grow and this is again focused on the seasons in Israel more than what we have over here, there is the former rains and latter rains that the Bible talks about. Two different periods of time within this growth calendar where they expected rain and they needed rain. And we're entering the time where those former rains would start. Where in Israel, it would start to become a rainy period for several months. So they would be ready. They would learn to get ready for those. They would know they needed to get that last harvest done because the rains were coming. And those rains would last for 3 or 4 months, and they were fairly heavy and fairly consistent, and it was cold. It wasn't a great and enjoyable time to be out in the field. But those rains would start in the fall and continue through the winter months. It's one of the proofs we use of why Christ couldn't have been born in December, right? Because the shepherds and no one wanted to be out in the open fields during December in Israel because it was cold and rainy and wet and miserable. And we find, there's even, you can write down Ezra 10:13. I don't think we need to turn there, but it basically just says the rainy season was an uncomfortable time. So in the physical calendar, Israel would be entering into that uncomfortable time, the rainy time. And spiritually, I think we can also see that many times we're entering into the rainy season spiritually, the time when it's difficult, when the Bible uses rain and storms as a metaphor for trials and tests. And anyone who's been around the church a long period of time knows that there is some truth to that during this time of the year is a time when trials and tests come to us in many times, many different years. That it is something that we should be prepared for. This being a rainy season shouldn't catch us by surprise if we, again, make that tie between the physical calendar and the spiritual principles that it mimics or that it teaches. Those former rains were unpleasant, but they were necessary. Israel, the land in Israel, got pretty dry in the summer. The sun was pretty hot. Things got baked, and the land became hard. And for them to be able to plant and have another harvest, they needed the rains to come to soften them up. Just like we need to be tested. We need trials. And of course, we need them to come from a loving God who doesn't give us trials more than we can handle. But this is a time where God uses, from time to time. I'm not saying every year we all face these big tests, but it's a time where God, if we open our hearts, God can soften us, can help prepare us so that our ground, our spiritual ground, is more ready to grow. That seeds that he can plant actually can take root. Rain, in Israel, when it came at the right time, was a promise of abundance. Even though it was no fun to go through, it held out hope that there would be a great harvest that would come after it. And so for us, as we move through between now and the next, the spring holy days, some of us will face trials. Some of them will face trials that are really difficult. And hopefully just remembering this spiritual tie-in helps us to get through those trials, to recognize that those trials can lead to abundance, to a future harvest that is great for each one of us. And we can look through those trials or look past those trials and have hope for what the future holds once we get through that time. The Bible also, as I talked about, these are the former rains that will be coming in here. The latter rains the Bible talks about are the ones that come in the spring. And again, it's all related to the harvest. Those latter rains are March and April, generally, in Israel. And again, if you've been in the church for a long time, you know that period leading up to the spring holy days is also another time where we are tempted. We face trials. We face some tests. And in the same way, when we face those, God is helping us. If we use them properly, if we allow God to step us through those, they become ways in which he can produce a greater harvest for each one of us, or from each one of us. This is a good time for each one of us to take a step and think about where we are in our spiritual life. How strong are we? How well fed are we? Are we starving spiritually, barely getting through, finding ourselves falling for temptation way more than we should? Or are we well fed spiritually and able to resist and able to make the right Christian decisions most of the time that we should? If we're starving, it's because we didn't do what we needed to do to harvest the way that we should have before the feast. I know, I can look at my life and I can certainly see times where I was starving, where I was barely getting by. And I can look back and see exactly the reason why that was happening, and it was on me. It was on me because I wasn't reaping. I wasn't planting, I wasn't sowing the way that I should have, the way that it needed to be done. One other lesson related to this growth cycle that we're talking about, and actually the final lesson we're going to talk about today, is that the times of rain are a time for maintenance. Times of rain are the times where you do maintenance, or you're able to do maintenance, where we can fix things that have become broken, where we can look at the things that maybe are worn out and replace them. You know what? And again, some of this came from just things I've written about the Geezer calendar, and how it was applying. And they brought out the point that when you're not able to go outside, when it's raining and uncomfortable, that's the time you spend inside. And what do you do if you're a farmer, you're growing, you work on maintenance, you work on making things ready, you fix the things that are broken, because you know you're going to need them to be in their best condition when you start to plant. This is a time within God's calendar, within the growth cycle, where we should be doing that maintenance. What's broken in your life? What isn't working the way that it should be? What do you need to fix? And all of us, there's a different answer to that question for each one of us. But I think all of us can see that we're not all in perfect working condition in every aspect of our life. And God does set this time aside for us to do that, to fix those things. He gives us that opportunity. I think if you think about that, this point, in the light of what needs to be fixed, what needs to be broken, it actually gives more meaning to what David wrote in Psalms 51. And we're going to go there and read some of the verses in Psalms 51. We'll begin in verse 1, Psalms 51. Try to put yourself in David's shoes and imagine how he must have felt when he wrote these words, because these are some of the more heartfelt words that I think David wrote about really where he saw himself and what he needed. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I acknowledge my transgressions. My sin is always before me. Against you and only you have I sinned. I've done this evil right in front of you, in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part you will make me to know wisdom. Purge me, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. Make me hear joy and gladness, that the bones that you have broken may rejoice. Hide your face from my sins. Blot out all of my iniquities and create in me a clean heart. Renew a steadfast spirit. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. Uphold me by your generous spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted to you. David's begging God. He says, I am broken. I'm broken in so many different ways. So many things that need to be fixed. And he's begging God to repair him, to fix him. Repair me, renew me. This is a time where our prayer should reflect that attitude. This is a time where we should be looking at what we need fixed, where we need God to reach in and make us better than what we are. You know, he pleads with him, really, in verse 11, don't take your spirit from me. I know I don't, the understanding behind that is I don't really deserve it. I'm not making use of it the way that I should. But don't take it away from me, please. Continue to work with me. Continue to be with me. And then fix me so that I can be an effective tool in your hands. I'm amazed, and I've been reading the Bible for a few years in my life. Amazed at how many times you can continue to see more meaning, deeper meaning in the Scriptures, in God's Word. And this is one of those things. I don't even remember right now where I stumbled across this, but taking that physical cycle of growth, preparation, planting, and growth, and seeing how it applies more than just at some holy days, but how I can apply it through my life, surprised me, and it was cool to see that parallel. To remind myself, and hopefully remind you as well, that this time, this part of the year, there's specific focuses. It isn't just cruising along. That I have a job to do. That I have to prepare myself, my spirit, my thoughts, many times my practices of how I'm going about worshiping and how I'm dealing with my relationship with God, that I should be working harder now than than other times to prepare myself. When you take your cue from the Geezer calendar, or the principles that they show there, and look for the lessons, we find that when God gives us a time of harvest, we should focus on that harvest. We should focus on getting as much as possible, scraping every last little piece of fruit or grain or vegetable that we possibly can from the harvest, because we need everything that God wants to give us. God promises an abundant harvest, but it's up to us whether we actually go through with the harvest or not. God isn't going to harvest it for us, but he provides times when there are harvests, and then he provides times where we prepare for the next one. And it's a continual cycle through our life, through the year, of working for the next harvest. It is a good time to go back and make sure we got everything from this last feast. And it is a great time to prepare for the spring holy days, to plow the ground, to plant the seeds, to give them time to grow. It's a time for us to draw closer to God, because we need that light that comes from him. We need everything that comes from him for whatever we're able to plant to grow. So if you apply that question that we read at the start of this message, men and brethren, men and women and brethren, what should we do? We need to get to work.